my favorite things in biology, and that's proteins. Proteins are these tiny dancers that shimmy and shake all throughout your body in order to perform a lot of really important jobs. So who here has heard of protein before? All right, a lot of us probably have, and you've probably heard about it in the context of your food. So if you look at your food label, you can see right there that you have protein, right? But a lot of you may only know of protein just sort of from your food. Today I'm going to help you think about protein like a scientist thinks about protein. And scientists such as myself think that proteins are really awesome. So I'm going to try to convince you all that proteins are super cool by first telling you what proteins are, and then going through where they come from, where they're found, and finally why they're super important. So right now you're probably thinking, okay, proteins seem important, I've heard of them before, but I don't really know what they are. So let's start off by talking about what proteins are. So proteins are macromolecules, and the cells in our body are made of macromolecules. Now this is a very complicated sentence, so let's break it down. So first, cells. Cells are the basic unit of life. They're basically like the building blocks of your body. So one example of a cell is a neuron, which we have shown right here, and this is the type of cell that makes up your brain. And so basically if you take 1 billion cells and you put them all together, you can make a brain. So if you take a billion neurons and a few other cell types and you put them all together, you make a brain. And so if you take all of these tissues and organs such as your brain and you put them together, you can create an organism, and that takes 37.2 trillion cells. So cells are just the fundamental unit of life, and when you put trillions and trillions of these cells together, you get an entire person. So now let's talk about what macromolecules are. So if we just break down the word, macro means large, and a molecule is just a chemical unit. So these are really, really big chemical units, essentially. So there are 4 types of macromolecules that you can find in your body. The first one is protein, which is going to be the star of our talk today. But there's also lipids, or fats. There are nucleic acids, which make up your DNA or your genes. And then there are carbohydrates, or sugars. So I told you that proteins are macromolecules. They're really big molecules. But the title of my talk is Tiny Dancers. So how can you think of proteins as large and small? It's all about context. So if you think about a protein being the size of a football, right? Then other molecules that are a lot smaller, such as water, would be about the size of a blade of grass. So when you're thinking about proteins relative to other molecules, proteins are absolutely massive. That's why they're macromolecules. But if we think about proteins in the context of our cells, again, if the protein is the size of a football, then the width of your cell is about 4.5 football fields long. So you can imagine you can pack a lot of footballs into 4.5 football fields, right? So you can pack a lot of protein into your cells. And to scale this up even further, again, if the protein is the size of a football, then an entire human body is like going around the world 2.5 times. So there are a ton of proteins that make up your body. So what makes proteins different from other macromolecules? It's all about what they're made up of. So proteins are made of amino acids, and I have them just drawn here as simple circles. We have 20 different amino acids that make up all of the proteins that we need in our body. And basically these amino acids come together sort of like beads on a string and to make these long chains. But the proteins in our body aren't all just these long spaghetti-like chains. That wouldn't be super interesting, right? So they actually fold into increasingly complicated shapes until they reach their final structure. And so every single protein has a unique shape, it has a unique structure. And that's all based on which amino acids make it up. So there's an infinite number of proteins that you can make because there's an infinite number of combinations of amino acids that you can add together and an infinite amount of lengths. So once all these amino acids are put together, they're folded sort of like how you fold a piece of paper during origami. Yep. So proteins dance all around the cells of our body, and so here's a little movie that sort of demonstrates that. So one of the other macromolecules that I introduced to you earlier were lipids or fats, and so these are the things that you see right here in the middle. And lipids actually make a barrier between the inside of your cell, down here, and the outside of your cells, out here. And you can see that, so pretty much everything else in this movie is protein. So you can see that there are proteins on the inside of your cell, the outside of your cell, as well as spanning in between the inside and the outside of your cell. And what you can really appreciate here is that they are moving around a lot. They're not just sitting there doing nothing. They are actively moving in order to perform their jobs. So proteins are all different. They come in lots of different shapes and sizes. And their shape and size really tells you a lot about what their job is in the cell. Another way that you can think about this is that their shape and size determines their signature dance move. So for example, this protein is perfectly suited to do ballet. This one's really great at hip hop. This one is like me, it can really only do jazz hands. And this one is good at doing tap. And so every single one of these proteins is built in a way that it can specifically perform its function or its signature dance move. So certain proteins are very talented and they have multiple signature dance moves. They know multiple dances. A protein that you may have heard of that can do this is called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is best known for transporting oxygen from our lungs to the rest of our body, but hemoglobin can also carry carbon dioxide from our body back to our lungs so that we can breathe it out. Some proteins need instructions in order to perform their signature dance move, and we call these instructions modifications because they're modifying or changing the protein a little bit. So one type of modification is just adding a little group onto our protein. This is usually a small molecule. And so a really important protein in our body that has to be modified in this way in order to perform its signature dance move is called P53. P53 is really important in preventing our cells from becoming cancerous. So if P53 doesn't have this additional little molecule on it, it can't prevent our cells from becoming cancerous. But once it has this molecule, it's able to perform its super important signature dance move, which is to stop cancer from forming in your cells. So another way that proteins can be modified in order to perform their signature dance move is by cutting off parts of the protein. So this protein right here can only perform its signature dance move once you cut the top off of it. So a protein that you may have heard of that is regulated in this way is insulin. So insulin is important for regulating our blood sugar. So when insulin is made, it's originally a lot bigger than it needs to be. So your body actually has to cut off this yellow portion right here in order for you to have a functional insulin protein that can go throughout your body to regulate your blood sugar levels. So now that we have a better idea of what proteins are, hopefully now you're starting to think, hey, proteins are kind of cool, right? So now let's talk about where proteins come from. So our body actually makes proteins. So I'm going to walk you through how our body is able to make protein. So I've already told you that our body can make a string of amino acids that can fold into a fully functional protein. But how does our body know which amino acids to put together? It's all encoded in our DNA. So the DNA has all of the information that we need in order to make this chain of amino acids to fold into a fully functional protein. So there's this really cool machine in our bodies called the ribosome that makes amino acid chains. However, this ribosome cannot read DNA. It's as if DNA was written in French, but the ribosome doesn't speak French. So in order for the ribosome to know which amino acids it needs to put together, we have to translate DNA into a language that the ribosome understands. So this language is called RNA. So basically our body will take DNA, translate it into RNA, and so it's as if we translated from French into Spanish, and our ribosome can speak Spanish, so the ribosome can read the information that's in the RNA in order to make these chains of amino acids that make up our proteins. So I told you earlier that our proteins can be modified, they can be changed in order to perform their signature dance move, and this step usually happens in between when the amino acids are put together and when the protein reaches its fully functional form, right there. So this is our overall timeline of how our bodies are able to make proteins. So I mentioned at the beginning that you've probably heard of protein because you've heard about it in the context of your food. And so it's really important that we get protein in our diet. But, I just told you that we can make our own protein. So why do we need to get it from our food? The first reason is that making new amino acids actually costs a lot of energy. And it's way more energy efficient to just take the proteins that we get from our food, chop them up into their amino acids, and reuse them in order to make new proteins for our body. Another reason why we need protein in our diet is because we actually can't make all 20 of the amino acids that we need in order to make our proteins. We can only make 11. So there are 9 amino acids that are called essential amino acids because it is absolutely essential that we get them from our diet since we cannot make them ourselves. So now that we have a better idea of where proteins are coming from, hopefully now you're thinking, hey, proteins are pretty interesting. So let's talk about where we can find proteins. Proteins are found all throughout the cells in our body. They are absolutely everywhere. If you were to shrink down to the size of a protein and try to walk around inside your cells, it would be like trying to wade through this really crowded dance party. You'd constantly be bumping into other proteins and other macromolecules, just while you're trying to do, your own signature dance move. So we have a few broad categories of proteins in our cells. One broad category are membrane proteins, and they're named membrane proteins because they sit in these lipid or fat membranes that I mentioned before that will provide a barrier between the inside of your cell and the outside of your cell. So you can see here that this protein is sitting in this membrane. The rest of our proteins are called soluble proteins because they're able to just float around in this free space inside of your cell. So specific proteins are found in specific places in our cell, and this really depends on what their signature dance move is. So proteins with complementary signature dance moves will be found in a similar spot in the cell. For example, if this area of the cell is our zone of famous dance moves, then we might find a protein whose signature dance move is the Macarena, or a protein whose signature dance move is the iconic lip from Dirty Dancing, or maybe a protein whose signature dance move is flossing. So to give you a real example of this concept, let's think about mitochondria. So mitochondria are often referred to as the powerhouse of the cell. And that's because they're the location where the cell makes energy that it needs in order to survive. Our cells store energy as something called ATP. And so basically mitochondria are where our cells make ATP. They're ATP factories. So if you were to zoom into this mitochondria, you would see a bunch of different proteins that all sit right next to each other, and they form this ATP assembly line. So all of their signature dance moves are involved in making ATP, or energy, that our cells need in order to function. And every single one of them has a different signature dance move that's required in order to make ATP. In fact, this one at the end, its signature dance move is literally the twist because it actually spins in order to make ATP that our cells need in order to have energy to do all the important things in order to help us survive. So now that we know that proteins are found everywhere, hope you're thinking, wow, proteins are really great. So let's wrap it up by talking about why proteins are important. So proteins are super important because they actually carry out the vast majority of jobs in your cells. So proteins are responsible for structure and stability in your cells. They're responsible for providing energy that your cells need in order to function. They're responsible for allowing for movement both within the cell and of the cell itself. They're responsible for getting rid of toxic materials that might harm the cell. They're responsible for communication between the outside of your cells and the inside of your cells. And they're really important to protect your DNA from getting damaged. So I'm going to highlight a couple of these really important jobs by going into a couple specific examples of proteins and what jobs they carry out in the cell. So first we're going to talk about microtubules. This is what a microtubule looks like. They're small tubes, as the name might suggest. These guys are soluble, so they're found all throughout the inside of your cells. And they're very talented proteins. They have a couple of different signature dance moves. They're involved in structure and stability within your cells, as well as for movement within your cells. So let's first talk about their role in structure and stability, microtubules act as a scaffold of your cell, sort of like you have scaffolding in a building. This is actually a picture that I took of microtubules in a cell. The microtubules are in green here, and you can see that they're spread all throughout the cell. So just like you have scaffolding all throughout a building that helps keep it upright, you have this sort of microtubule scaffolding all throughout the cell to make sure that it's structurally sound and isn't just going to flop over and not be able to do anything interesting. The other signature dance move of microtubules is that it allows for movement within your cells. So microtubules actually act as a road that other proteins can walk on in order to carry things from one place in your cell to another. So another type of protein that I would like to introduce to you are receptors. And so receptors, this is a cartoon, it's just a general receptor, connects the outside of your cell to the inside of your cell. So they sit on that barrier between the outside of the cell and the inside of the cell. So receptors are membrane proteins because they're sitting at this barrier. And their signature dance move is communication from the outside of your cells to the inside of your cells. So they're kind of like a cell phone, which allows you to communicate from one place to another. So let's say you want to call up your friend on the phone to tell them some information that you have. You're not just going to press random numbers into your phone and hope that it reaches them, right? There's a very specific number that you have to call in order to reach that cell phone. Similarly, receptors have very, very specific molecules or proteins that are sort of like their phone number. It's the signal that they need in order to transmit information from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. So when this small molecule or small protein is in the area of the receptor, it will actually bind to the receptor, and that'll cause a change on the inside of the cell, so that the cell knows, hey, this signal is out here. I should do something. So proteins are also super important, not just within your individual cells, but throughout the entirety of your body. These are the proteins that make up your bones, your skin, and your hair. There are proteins that act as hormones to transmit really important messages all throughout your body. There are proteins that can detect germs that may have gotten into your body and prevent you from getting sick. There are proteins that can carry oxygen all throughout your body. There are proteins that allow you to digest your food. There are proteins that allow you to move. And this is just a very, very short list of proteins. There are proteins that are doing pretty much every single job that you could think that needed to be done within your body. So let's go over what we've talked about. So first we learned that proteins are macromolecules that are made up of amino acids, and they have a variety of different signature dance moves. And so they all have a different signature dance move, meaning that they all have a different job that they play in your cell. So we learned that we're actually able to make proteins based on the information in our DNA. We learned that proteins are found absolutely everywhere in our cells. And we learned that proteins are really important to perform really critical jobs in our cells and in our body. So now you're going to look here about the role of a few specific proteins in disease. First, Adriana is going to tell you about the role of two proteins in Alzheimer's disease, and Lauren will tell you about the role of one protein in various neurological conditions.
Thank you, Emma.